So in Chapter 6, we're looking at the other two macroeconomic statistics, inflation levels and unemployment levels. And again, it's probably useful that you see that the price levels in the United States are about 1.1% increase from a year ago, and that unemployment levels in the U.S. are about 4.9%. If only things this class were that easy that you just had to remember two numbers. So it's a very simple chapter. We're just looking at these two statistics and how they're calculated. Here we go. The history of economists with these statistics is a little bit tortured. Because there was a time when economists thought that we had mastered this. And by that I mean, these are the two things that, everyday people who aren't economists, the ways that they experience the economy are through these things. And so if they're looking at the economy and they see inflation and unemployment, that affects their perceptions of how the economy is doing. And there used to be the belief that actually that you could do one and it would offset the other. So for instance, you could have high inflation, but you would have low unemployment, right? Or you could have high unemployment and low inflation. And so that then all that economists had to do is think about what kind of mix they wanted of these two things. Well, it didn't end up being that easy, and the relationship that existed broke down by the late 60s, early 70s. And so because of that, then economists have been spending most of their time then thinking about how that exists otherwise here. Well, let's look at inflation. There we go. This would be from the first menu of McDonald's, a very simple menu. I think I'd get the fries. I'd get the Coke, the thirst-quenching Coke. And I'll get a delicious cheeseburger. Oh, interesting. This one's plural, and this one's singular. Huh, interesting. Not sure why that's the case. Anyway, look at these prices. Price of 15 cents. I believe this would be from about the 1950s. I think it should be something higher, controlling for inflation. Hamburgers are cheaper today in real terms than they are here. And when I say real terms, what I'm doing then is essentially removing the effects of inflation. So when your grandparents or even your parents say that things used to be cheaper back in their day, of course they were, because of inflation. What is it? What it means to have inflation is that prices rise over time. Why prices rise over time will actually be something that we look at a few chapters from now. Why things rise in time comes from the fact that we're changing the money supply over time. And as we change the money supply, that changes the performance of the dollar and how much the dollar is worth. And the general idea is that if I print more dollars, what that means is that each existing dollar then becomes less valuable because I have more of them existing, which would mean I would have inflation. So where do we see the most inflation? In economies that are increasing the money supply more dramatically. So that's how a government then, or a central bank more specifically, can control inflation levels, by controlling the money supply. Why is it a bad thing? Inflation's bad because what it means is that workers have to get paid more, and it also means that those who have saved money face the problem of they've got money that they want to spend, but that money is not worth as much as it used to be. The two causes of the I mean, we already kind of tried to talk about this one, that changing the money supply leads to changes in the value of money. That's this right here. But there's another way of thinking about it. And that's that there's supply side inflation and demand side inflation. And when we're talking about supply side inflation, what we're talking about is this idea that if a business has to buy lots of materials, and so let's say the economy is doing well and the business buys lots of materials, those materials are going to go up in price. And the firm then, as a result, raises its prices. So it could be firms raising their prices because they're building so much stuff. The other side of it could be is that consumers feel really good, and so they buy lots of stuff. And as they buy lots of stuff, that drives up prices. So all these things can be happening at a particular moment in time, and that can all drive the inflation levels in the economy. Now, the way that we're measuring the inflation level in the United States primarily is with something you may have seen before called the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. It's a price index, meaning that as an index, what it's doing is it's a fixed basket of goods. And I'm tracking how much that fixed basket of goods, how much the price of that fixed basket of goods changes over time. Now, there's other ways I could measure the price level. There would be things like the Producer Price Index or the Gdp Deflator. They're useful, but you don't see them talked about as much in the popular press as you do the Consumer Price Index. Which, again, in the case of the U.S., at least this most recent data suggests that it was about 1.1%. Now, there's actually a worse problem. It doesn't seem like it would be bad, but I can describe to you that it really is. And that would be deflation, that prices are going down. That's generally the worst situation. There was a very brief time period in 2009, and the time period before that would be 1933, when prices actually fell in the United States. The problem with deflation is that we don't have a lot of mechanisms within the economy to accommodate prices falling. For instance, what do? Do we make employees accept lower wages? Yeah, you can, but it makes people really, really grumpy to accept lower wages. It generally is the sign of an incredibly distressed economy, and there's not a lot of solutions to it. The Japanese economy faces either incredibly low inflation or deflation, depending on the relevant time period that you're looking at. So let's talk about that CPI a little bit more. As I said before, it's a fixed basket of goods. It's a fixed basket of goods that's what we think the typical urban consumer will buy in a given month. And we just basically, what the government does is it goes out to various stores and it tracks how much to buy that basket, how much that would change over time. That basket contains about 200 goods. They look at various municipalities. They look at lots of different cities, and they try to shop at regular stores. They don't go to Costco or Sam's Club. They go to regular stores. They don't buy things at discount. And they just look at the basket changes every few years. They change the components of it. So, for instance, don't know if it would include, like, for instance, Uber or Lyft, because that product might be too new to be included in this CPI number. And so what we can then do is look at the price of that basket over time and how it's changing. So the idea is that, let's say that let's say that the total cost of that basket of goods in 2010 was $1,500. That the price of that same basket of goods in 2015 was $1,750. We need to construct a CPI number. To do that, we need to know something about what is our base period going to be. You will either be told what the base time is, or you'll have to find it. But basically what we're saying here is that if the base year is 2010, then what I would be doing here, using this equation here, is have 1,500 divided by 1,500 times 100. That would be essentially 1 over 1. Would give me a CPI of 100. The CPI number is always 100 in the base year. The CPI is always 100 in the base year. As for the CPI number in 2015, it would then be 1,750 over 1,500 times 100. Right, which will then give me, just feeling intellectually lazy here. If I round it, gives me 117. Which would mean over that 5-year time period, there was 17% inflation, or an average of 3.4% annually. And there we go. That's how these statistics, that's how we get our measures of the inflation levels. We construct the index numbers from our expenditure data. We get the expenditure data to calculate the index numbers. From the index numbers, we then calculate the percentage change in that. And I could see that it was a total change of 17%. You can use the equations for percentage changes to calculate that kind of thing, but also eyeballing it should be pretty obvious that that was a 17% change. Now CPI numbers, they're not perfect. The one problem with it is that the really big one would be what's known as the substitution bias. And in the substitution bias, what we're saying here is that we are presuming, because it's a fixed basket of goods, that consumers are continually buying the same quantities of the products. We wouldn't necessarily think that that's the case, though, because we know that consumers substitute away from goods that are more expensive. So, if consumers substitute away from goods that are more expensive, that would mean that because they're presuming that there are no changes, that we then have an overstatement of actual inflation levels. And so then a great deal of work has been done by economists to try to reduce the size of that substitution bias. Also, what we know is that, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier here, is that what people buy actually changes quite a bit over time. And products get better. And so we have things like a quality bias, a new product bias. We even have something known as a outlet bias, because we're not allowing people to go to outlet stores or membership stores. Because they're not allowed to do these things, which is what normal people do, this is also not going to be part then of the CPI, which would again mean that the CPI index is not appropriately measuring what's going on in the economy. It also is not looking at what's going on with medical costs that are paid for by insurance companies, and that's a pretty big amount. So obviously insurance companies do spend a lot of money for our health care, and when it's paid by the government in terms of Medicare and Medicaid, or when it's paid for by our employer-based health insurance, those costs are not that data is not collected as part of the CPI. But yet it's a significant amount of money that's being spent. In terms of inflation levels, the other ways that we could look at it besides the CPI would be with the producer price index. So there we're looking at how much firms spend on the items that they use to produce their things. And then we could look at the overall change of all the prices in the economy. So instead of just looking at what consumers buy, or instead of looking at just what producers buy, we could look at all the goods in the economy. We should see them, at least in general, being somewhat close to each other. When we look at the producer price index, I'm looking at mining and manufacturing industries, lots of different industries, lots of different commodities, and I'm basically looking at all the stages of production of what that firm uses to make their output. And I'm looking at what's happening to the price of those inputs as they make that final product. The broadest measure by far, something that economists actually use quite a bit, is the GDP deflator. And that would mean then that I'm comparing my nominal GDP to my real GDP levels. Or in other words, that I'm trying to hold the prices constant as I allow my quantities to change. But then if I compare the nominal GDP in a year to the real GDP in a year, I get a sense of what the GDP deflator should be. Why do we care? Well, one reason why we might care, one way in which it's used, is that, for instance, Social Security goes up by exactly what the CPI numbers are. Lots of labor union contracts go up by what the inflation levels are, as measured in there. Long-term contracts, for instance, like the rail project, has things tied to inflation levels. And unfortunately, for the rail project, what actually happened was far greater than what was expected. That no one expected actually that the prices would go up as fast as they did for construction costs. And this is then going back to this idea when I was talking about the real GDP versus the nominal GDP. That would be how we then convert nominals to reals. What we do is we take our nominal, which would be a current year price, and a current year quantity, and we multiply it by the ratio of the indices, the base year index and the current year index, to get the real number. How can it be a bad thing? Well, probably the worst thing about inflation is especially if you live on a fixed income. Because that then means is that your purchasing power, what you can buy with your money, is going down to the extent that there is inflation. Because your income levels aren't changing. With the inflation level, things are just getting more expensive. Inflation is also meaningful and impactful for those that have lent money or borrowed money. If you're a borrower, you benefit from inflation, especially if it's unexpected inflation. As a debtor, you're generally hurt by inflation. Especially when it's unexpected. Or unanticipated. And that's what we mean right here. The only way that you can avoid any of the consequences of inflation is by accurately predicting what it's going to be, which is an incredibly difficult job, which is why most of the time contracts are written so that we just agree on what the index is that we want to use, and most of them use the CPI. And so if we just say your income will go by exactly the CPI, then you would have no issues. And again, Social Security is one example of a stream of income you get once you retire that changes in value by the CPI levels. And there we just see this here, right? That creditors then are harmed by the unanticipated inflation. The reason why these lenders are hurt by the unanticipated inflation is because they're going to be receiving money that is less valuable. Those who are borrowing the money, the debtor, is helped by unanticipated inflation because it's actually easier to pay back their money that they borrowed. And then we've got really cool situations. We have cool situations where the inflation levels increase by extremely high amounts. The famous one that economists like to look at from time to time is Zimbabwe, which had something like 1,000,000% inflation, or people look at 1920s Germany. And even if you just look up, especially if you look up 1920s Germany hyperinflation, and you look on Google and you look at images, you'll see people like burning bricks of money because it was actually cheaper to burn the money than to use it to buy firewood. Most of the time what happens is that the government's about to fail, and the government then prints lots of cash to be able to pay back its debts. And it prints so much cash that the economy loses money. In this case, it was caused by Germany having to pay back war reparations for World War I. In this case, it was caused by economists at least believe it was caused by Robert Mugabe, who's still the leader of Zimbabwe, and some of the efforts he took to kind of control debts within the country and pay civil service salaries by printing lots of cash. Now let's transition here and look at unemployment levels. So let me pause it here so that let's look at the data here. Okay, so what we see in the data here for the unemployment numbers, we do see during these periods of recession, which is our gray period here, we do see that same uptick in the unemployment numbers. We see the peak here of, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 10%. The highest, though, ever was, I believe, 10.3, 10.8 during the very severe recession in the early 80s, which was actually a result of trying to get rid of very high inflation during the 1970s. Okay, so going back to the slides here. What we're seeing here in terms of unemployment numbers is that, well, the highest point, which had not been covered in that data that we looked at, was 25% during the Great Depression. During World War II, obviously, was incredibly low of 1%. The fact that it's 4.8%, 4.9% today, is quite low. It's lower than the long-term average of 5 to 6%. So this is a very healthy economy that we have right now in terms of unemployment numbers. So what does it mean? What does it mean to be employed? What does it mean to be unemployed? To be employed means that you are working for pay. To be unemployed means two things. Obviously that you're not working, you don't have a job, but you also have to be available to work and looking for work. So you not only have to be not working, but you also have to be looking for work. And what we see is that sometimes what happens is that some people don't look for work. They don't look for work because they are so discouraged that they just give up. So what we do here then is that we understand the world as having a country like our own, having a total population which in the case of the U.S. is about 320 million people. That's our total population. And what we do is we split it up into two categories. Those who aren't working because they're like in prison, because they're kids, hospitalized. There's in the military would be the other big thing. These are people that can't work because of some age or other obligation that means that they can't. But then we have our civilian, non-institutional population, which we actually break down into labor force and not in labor force. As you see up here, labor force is actually the sum of the employed and the unemployed. So labor force is going to be my sum of the employed and unemployed make up my labor force. Who's not in the labor force? That would be retirees, college students, the rich, the lazy. I don't know what the Kardashians fulfill, if they're rich or lazy or both. The problem is that within this category as well, we can add the discouraged worker. And what you see is movements between these two categories. The problem is that some people get so discouraged that they stop looking for work. And when they stop looking for work, they leave the unemployed and go into the not in the labor force. The unemployment rate then is equal to the size of my unemployed over the size of my labor force times 100, so that I get a ratio here. How do we do it? How do we get that data? We call people up on the phone. We contact 60,000 different households every month. And we ask simple questions such as, are you working? Are you not working? Right? And we try to put people into the appropriate category that they're in. And then the first Friday of the month is when the unemployment numbers are released, I believe at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. And generally when the number is released, it has a big impact on the labor market, on the stock market. There are other kinds of statistics. There are other ways that we try to measure the unemployment rate or how many people are working. There's a payroll survey The payroll survey, it turns out that they look at companies that issue paychecks, and they ask, well, how many paychecks are you issuing now? Right, and that would be a good way of tracking it. They also just look at the number of people that are filing for unemployment. These are somewhat used, but not very often. The big thing that's being used, though, is the unemployment statistics that are collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Here's my discouraged worker effect that I was referring to earlier. In my discouraged worker effect, what we see then is that the unemployment rate might not look so bad, that it actually probably should have been worse than 10% in the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis. It should have been worse, but some people were too old to look for work and they just didn't bother to look. Or some people, again, people just thought it was so bad, why bother to even waste my time to go look for work? Also, the other problem with the unemployment statistic is that it doesn't take into account the fact that I might be doing something that doesn't involve my skills. So, for instance, if I lost my job, maybe I would get a job at Starbucks or at Target. I own a lot of red clothes. Right, maybe I get a job at Target, but a Target doesn't require a PhD in economics. And I would be counted as employed, but we wouldn't necessarily think that I'm using the skills that I've acquired over time. So is unemployment then, I guess, kind of a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it turns out that there is some level of unemployment that's actually a good thing, because it actually takes time to find the proper job, the job that will use the skills that you've acquired over time. And so that's the whole point of unemployment insurance, is that it basically gives you the finances to cover that period of time that it takes you to find a new job. The name that we have for that good kind of unemployment that economists see is called frictional unemployment. That frictional unemployment, again, is the time it takes to find a new job, the time it takes employers to interview and find the right kind of employee. All that takes time. And so there's a natural friction in the labor market that exists. And that's what we see here. Added to that is the structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is when you're unemployed, but now instead of being unemployed for a short period of time, you're actually employed for a much longer period of time. And you're unemployed for a longer period of time because it turns out that the skills, what you've been trained in, is no longer required in that kind of economy. So for instance, if I was a shoe cobbler, that kind of skill is not really required as much in our economy. And so because of that, I'm going to be unemployed for a very long period of time. If we add these two up, we actually get what's called the natural unemployment rate, which is my frictional unemployment plus my structural unemployment. The sum of these two is the natural unemployment, which economists have generally estimated for the United States to be about 5%. So a fully performing economy in the U.S. should have about 5% unemployment. Now, it can differ from that. It can be different than that, and then that's where we would get our cyclical unemployment. So the actual measured unemployment is then equal to the natural unemployment plus the cyclical unemployment. There's some unemployment that comes from the fact that more people are going to be out of a job when there's a recession. So when we saw that statistic that it was 10% in 2009, that was essentially equal to the natural unemployment of 5% plus the 5% that came from the dramatically slowed economy. Where this actual measured unemployment, again, was the number of unemployed over the size of the labor force. Times 100. The general belief is that in terms of frictional and structural unemployment, you're largely relying on unemployment insurance, but that really can't do too much. To really reduce cyclical unemployment, that's when we have to use fiscal policy and monetary policy, which is the things that we're looking at in the later part of this course. But basically, you need government involvement and you need the central bank adjusting things. And that's then where we see our natural rate of unemployment. Economists do not think that a fully performing economy should be at 0%, that there should be some unemployment that exists. And having some unemployment exist is actually a good thing. It reduces price and pressures in the economy. But essentially, in the economy that we have right now, as of today, there is basically zero or slightly negative cyclical unemployment. And to get slightly negative cyclical unemployment, that means that workers are getting hired that typically wouldn't get hired. Maybe one with some criminal history, or maybe one that's habitually late to work. These are the kind of workers that are getting hired today. What's the fancy word for the natural unemployment rate? It's called NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. That's the fancy term for the natural unemployment rate. It just means that it controls the inflationary pressures in the economy. Now, we do have to always be concerned with the fact that in some economies, the economy can recover, but we might not see that necessarily that big rush to have the workers being hired. Now, part of this might be because people start to do more meaningful things and they don't want to work. But the other issue might be is that the workers aren't getting hired because they're too old or they don't have the experience. The firm has learned how to deal with having fewer workers. In general, though, what we see is that eventually at some point those workers do have to get hired, and that's when we start to see the economy start to do even much better. Okay. I guess let me end this by this discussion of the economic statistics by looking at this data that we have here and looking at it for Hawaii, which we can do. Let's look at the unemployment rate first. Look at that. That's beautiful data. 2.9% unemployment in Hawaii. That is an incredibly tight labor market. Incredibly tight labor market. I don't even know what to say. That's obviously here on the island of Oahu. Instead, we could look at the GDP for Hawaii. And the GDP for Hawaii is about $80 million out of a $17 trillion economy. Not that much, but it's Hawaii. What are you going to do? And then finally, we could look at the CPI numbers. Actually, I don't want to look at it that way. We probably want to look at it as Oh, it's all right. It doesn't matter too much here. We should see, not surprisingly, increasing prices in the economy, and if anything, the prices are growing a little bit faster for Hawaii as a whole. Let's just add the quick data here. And you see this here. This is a cool way of doing it, is that the red line indicates the US as a whole, the blue line indicates Hawaii, and we're seeing higher prices in Hawaii. I guess if anything, this graph proves to you that when people say that prices are high in Hawaii, it is in fact true, and we would see that here, is that the inflation rate in Hawaii is higher, but the unemployment rate is lower.